Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. King O'Malley these days is mostly remembered for the pub named after him in Canberra. An early Australian politician and one of the key founders of Canberra, O'Malley's is a story of murder and controversy, reinvention and mischief, which belie the fact he was responsible for Canberra's alcohol prohibition from 1910 to 28. Joining me to discuss the story of King O'Malley is author of How James Became King, the true story of James King O'Malley, Brian O'Malley. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Brian.
Hi, Georgina. Thanks for the invitation to discuss the book and what new discovery of O'Malley's past, I might add, because certainly in his biography online, it states that his early years are by his own account, in inverted commas. So his time prior to coming to Australia has always been shrouded in mystery. Whenever he first arrived in 1888, he was very much selling himself as a Yankee, and he was out in the West, almost a gunslinger, embellishing his story around that time. But then in 1896, he was elected to the South Australian Parliament, which was a colony, of course, at that point. And a question started to be raised about what his antecedents were, because people were saying, well, clearly if he's American, he was ineligible to stand.
And of course, I mean, before we get on to the story of King O'Malley's early history and why he's so significant to Australia, the question has to be asked, Brian, are you a relation? Because you share a last name.
That's the question. That's the first question everyone asks. And my wife would say the answer, you should be very clear that you're not. Now, I won't go into the boring DNA aspect of it, but I'm probably not. I would say no, probably not. However, my family does overlap with his family at the same time and place in a town called Pittston, Pennsylvania, where my great-grandfather and his two brothers went, and O'Malley's family has a very strong relationship with that town as well. So clearly, during the famine era, that was a place that people went to, the O'Malleys. So I'm probably not related because I know through my DNA testing. However, the families clearly do overlap. As I mentioned in the book, I've left a little paragraph in there as a kind of a homage to my ancestors.
Oh, lovely. Well, I mean, it is quite a coincidence that your last name's O'Malley and you're writing a book about someone called O'Malley. And it would have been nice, but that's okay. So both families obviously emigrating from Ireland in that century.
Yes, around the 1840s, 1850s. Clearly the so-called famine was going on at that time. And just to backtrack a slight amount, I've been doing genealogical work for about 40 years as an amateur genealogist. And over those years, I've kind of looked to see whether or not I was related, and nothing ever showed up, of course, because his name King, it should be in inverted commas wherever you see it because it was a made-up name. So that was part of the reason I never kind of stumbled across King O'Malley in my genealogical research. So about 4 years ago, I thought I'll have another more focused look at this and see if I'm related or not. And that's how this all unfolded, how the story began.
Fantastic. For those in our audience, Brian, who are unfamiliar with King O'Malley, and God forbid there are some people who might be unfamiliar with him and might not have visited that Irish pub in Canberra that is an homage to King O'Malley to this day, just tell us who he was. Why is he important to the telling of the story of Australia?
Yes, he was in the 1901, the original federal parliament, and was the Minister for Home Affairs in 1910 and around there. And he was involved in establishing the location of Canberra. Indeed, he wanted to name Canberra Myola, M-Y-O-L-A, until people pointed out, some people twigged to the fact that's kind of an anagram of O'Malley, and then he backtracked and we got Canberra instead. Shakespeare was another name that he had in his back pocket as well, but Canberra it was, not Myola.
He was quite the extraordinary figure, as we will discuss in today's episode. He really was able to reinvent himself time and time again, and he must have had an amazing sense of his own importance, irrespective of whether it was warranted.
Indeed, yes. I mean, one might use the word grandiosity, and this goes back. In fact, that's one of the ways I was able to trace him through his behaviour. That's one of the characteristics that starts in America and follows through to his time in Kansas. So his behaviour was kind of a beacon almost, a lighthouse to finding him. So the fact that he wanted to call Canberra Myola is no great surprise, actually, it turns out.
Yeah, no great surprise, but still, breathtaking in its,
Yes, indeed, grandiosity.
And grandiosity. Yeah. So King O'Malley, someone who becomes Home Affairs Minister in the Fisher government, but someone who has come to Australia from the United States. Now, your book really examines his origin story, which is highly contested. He has his own version, and that's questionable whether it's accurate. We've had on this podcast the biographer of Chris Watson, the first Labor Prime Minister of Australia, but I think the first Labor leader of a national government in the world too. He was also not from Australia, and in fact he was
South America, was it, or something?
Yeah, sort of
some connection?
Born in Chile, actually, born off the coast of Chile. So I think in the end ends up being a New Zealand citizen and is able to
creeps in through the door.
Yes, run for Parliament in Australia. But of course, King O'Malley's story is way more complicated even than Chris Watson's. So tell me about his origin story, because it is typical of King O'Malley, extraordinary in its grandiosity.
Yeah, that's right. Well, James Malley, and people might say, is his name O'Malley or Malley? When the Irish went to America during that era, many of them dropped the O off to become a bit more Anglo because there was some fear of the Irish back then. So James Malley's family arrived. He was born in Norwich, Connecticut on the 19th of August, 1857, and his father was a merchant. His uncle was a very successful merchant in Connecticut. He owned a big department store, which provided the source of some substantial funds in the future. And the first 20 years or so are not very clear still. But then on 6th of August 1881, the body of a young woman was washed up on the shore of New Haven, Connecticut. And attention immediately was drawn to the last person to be seen to be with this young woman, and that was James Malley. Now, James Malley is King O'Malley. My book goes to great lengths, in great detail, to prove this connection all the way through. So then there was a trial, an inquest, and then him and his cousin, Walter, and Walter's beau, Blanche Douglas, from New York, from Lizzie Bundy's brothel in New York, was Walter's partner, and she was the chaperone for this young woman, Jennie Cramer. Then they were incarcerated for 12 months, and the following year a trial took place where they were found not guilty, the trio. And then James Malley's adventure started from there. There's a seminal book on the trial called Arsenic Under the Elms by a woman called Virginia McConnell. And towards the end of that, she makes the statement that James Malley disappears. There's no paper trail of him in the northeast of the United States from about August 1883, which is when James Malley appears in Kansas, essentially, and reinvents himself.
I guess in that era too, it was easy to slip between states in the United States and reinvent yourself because there wasn't obviously the internet.
Indeed.
And people weren't necessarily coming and going from different parts of the United States, or let alone the world, to verify your story.
Yes. I think part of the story goes to the opening of America through the railway system as well. During the trial, he was actually, or prior to the trial, in the inquest, he was actually identified as a drummer. Now, it's a word that's kind of gone out of usage, but drumming up business, I guess, is what you would say. And even prior to the murder, he was identified as a drummer, which is a person who's on the road selling merchandise and this kind of thing, drumming up business, essentially. And that all has to do with the, as I said, opening up of the United States through the railway system.
And when he appears in Kansas, what does he get up to in Kansas? What makes Kansas such an important part of his story?
Indeed. Yes. Well, he did many things during that period. He was very adept at looking for the main chance, shall we say. So first of all, he was identified as a clock plier, and many of these things are kind of lost to the modern world, if you like. But essentially they were people who got substandard articles and went out to the far-flung reaches of places and sold them at great profit. So that was how he appeared. Then he was a lightning rod peddler, and yet again another kind of questionable profession where they would go out into the back blocks, and they would sell to a farmer a lightning rod. And one saw quoted in a newspaper where the farmer was quoted $15 which then became $1,500 when they asked for payment. So then he moved into insurance sales, and all the while he still had a bent for the theatre. And that's certainly something that comes out in the original trial, that the connection through to his cousin and others was via the theatre. And in fact, there's a scene in the Kansas episode where he meets Schwartz the playwright and introduces himself to Schwartz the playwright and says, I want you to write me a play. I'm James Malley of Jennie Cramer fame, hero of Jennie Cramer fame. And amongst other things, he says, and these are all quotes, I can be a tragedy king when I like. And he's identified himself as James Malley, and he's the tragedy king. And I think that is probably a precursor for his eventual name. He saw himself as a theatre goer, and he recommends to Schwartz that two of the leading Shakespearean actors of the period should play him in the role. They were touring from overseas. He said, Ellen Terry and the other fellow, the male actors have gone out of my head at the moment, but basically he wanted the two leading Shakespearean actors to play the leading roles in the play James Malley, the lightning rod peddler. So certainly grandiosity is, yet again, the word you might use to describe him. So he wasn't hiding the fact who he was.
Calling himself a tragedy king, what was the reason he got off for the murder of Jennie Cramer? I mean, did he always claim he was innocent, or was it some sort of technicality?
Yes. Yeah, well, I alluded to his uncle, Uncle Edward, who was at the time a big department store, and he had lots of money. And one of the quotes at the time was that witnesses had their mouths covered in greenbacks. So essentially it was seen at the time as being a very big miscarriage of justice. In fact, probably in American history, it's probably one of the more publicised trials and recognised miscarriage of justice. So essentially the three of them got off. There is a scene early on in the trial where Blanche Douglas, Walter's beau, hears Jennie Cramer screaming on the stairs, and James Malley is dragging her up the stairs, and Walter goes out, Walter, his cousin, goes and to calm the situation, and then they retire. Jennie Cramer and James Malley retire for the evening, and that's the last we see of Jennie Cramer, essentially. So the evidence would probably, she had arsenic in her body as well. And as I said, I mentioned Virginia McConnell's book too, if listeners want to investigate more the actual trial. That's a recommended book. So, yes, it was essentially a miscarriage of justice. Because from looking in, 140 years later, I doubt that James Malley would have got off.
I mean, quite extraordinary that he can just move to another state and this is all forgotten, or at least his kind of life as a con artist and
Indeed.
A way of crafting a story that is believed by people seems to have led him to keep getting away with it. So tell me then, Brian, he starts to develop an interest in politics around this time after the murder trial, and as he's sort of getting into the con artist life, let's be, for want of a better expression.
Yeah, well, I suppose he kind of moved into the theatre of politics.
Yes, indeed.
So Lane, who was vying for president, I believe, that around that time, he stumped, being a kind of a stump orator. He would go and speak on behalf of a particular political candidate, and he undertook that a number of occasions, actually. And he started to get a reputation as a stump orator.
Was he quite good at it? I mean, was his
He was actually, yes, he was. Yes, in spite of the nefarious background that he had in terms of the murder, he clearly was a charismatic person who could hear what the crowd wanted, and he would then provide whatever that thing was in a theatrical kind of, or in a local hall or whatever. And he was a bit indefatigable, I suppose, in terms of travel. Going back to the drumming days, travel was part of the thing. And I've quoted in the book at one point how he was stumping for a particular candidate, and, his calendar for the next week was a different town every day. He would go to a different town, one after the other, and stump for this particular candidate. Although in the Blaine case, one of the newspapers reported that he just returned back to Kansas to his kind of base, but he had retained a doleful souvenir of it, a Blaine celebratory hat or something. So that was all he basically got from it, was the doleful souvenir of a hat from the exercise. So
not very lucrative.
Blaine didn't get up that time.
Right.
Although he did, O'Malley does quote later on in life in one of his letters to an acolyte of his, he does quote that he stood for Blaine, and if Blaine had got elected, he would have been ambassador for Chile. This is what King O'Malley and the King O'Malley guys in Australia declares to one of his correspondents.
So Blaine, the candidate, what sort of politics was he about? And I guess what sort of politics was O'Malley about? I mean, is it
yes,
left,
that's a good question,
right,
actually.
working class, the business? Where was he situated on the
I think, well, he certainly, and I'm not sure if it comes from his Irish background, but certainly he was home rule for Ireland. He came from that background, not surprisingly, of course. So I think his politics were probably slightly left-leaning, but it's hard to tell sometimes whether or not that left-leaningness just to ingratiate himself with the miners and the workers. And, I mean, later in life he had rental properties, in fact, some in Melbourne, in Little Collins Street even, and they weren't upmarket rental properties, if I can put it that way. So, yes, he would espouse kind of left-leaning. Now, whether or not that was heartfelt is a difficult question to answer. But certainly whenever he did eventually come to Australia, the miners, and in particular the miners, were people that he would have gone and spoken to about his politics.
He got involved at that time too, didn't he, Brian, with the prohibitionist movement, which of course becomes pertinent with his ambitions for Canberra.
Yes, that's right.
What was that about? Was he a lifelong teetotaler himself?
A couple of times he actually quotes, and he says, particular precise date in the 1880s, the precise date escapes me just for the time being. But one thing that is not immediately apparent, and I did find a newspaper article talking about prohibitionists. Essentially what it was saying was that prohibitionists were amongst the worst fraudsters going, including lightning rod peddlers and others. So, as I said, it's not immediately apparent that prohibitionists were kind of out for the main chance as well, but given his behaviour, it's no surprise that he was attracted into that domain as well. So, yes, the prohibition thing was kind of a vehicle along with many other things, including evangelism, which I haven't mentioned. He was actually an evangelist as well. And that's one of the first key things that you find when he arrives in Kansas, that he pops up as Bishop James Malley of New Haven, Connecticut, which is James Malley of New Haven, Connecticut, aka accused murderer. And that he was out amongst the people of Connecticut at that stage, and he was going to be down by the river preaching. So, I mean, once again, you go back to this kind of theatrical notion that it's all about influencing people through theatre, I suppose. And all the things he was doing were theatrical, and some of them were designed to make money, and some were just so that he could stand up and influence people, I guess.
Yeah, obviously a real urge to get attention, to be admired and listened to.
Indeed.
As well as obviously the money-making ventures as well. What happened then, Brian, when he inevitably gets caught as a con artist pretending to be a bishop or a reverend, all those sort of moments?
Yes, well,
presumably he needs to kind of move on pretty quickly, does he?
Yeah, that's right. Well, he does in Kansas. He evolves eventually to become, he's known as J.K. Malley, or Bishop J.K. Malley, as it turns out. And then when he's selling insurance, he gets a promotion, which is, once again, it's referenced in the book. The local newspaper says that Brother Malley, because he often called himself Brother Malley, apart from Bishop and other appellations that he used, he was promoted to be the insurance agent for the Northwest, which is Washington Territory back then, and Oregon, so on the northwest coast of the US. And in the meantime, he leaves there and goes up into the Northwest, and the superintendent of the insurance company, about a month after his arrival, says how well he's doing, because, in fact, this is when he appears on stage for the first time on the 25th of February 1887 as King O'Malley in Oregon. And that's the first actual reference, public reference anyway, to him being King O'Malley. His supervisor writes a glowing report about how he'd done $200,000 worth of business or some figure like that. But unfortunately, a few months later, people realise that the insurance that they've been sold is basically all a scam, and he's hounded out of Washington Territory. Although he does go backwards and forwards, he still kind of braves the crowds for whatever reason.
We've got him starting in Connecticut, then he's in New York, And then
Backwards and forwards, yes.
and then he's in Kansas, and then to Oregon and Washington State.
And then down to San Francisco.
And then down to San Francisco. So he's really covering the entire continent of North America, really.
Does. Yes, he does.
Well, at least the United States of America. He listed the most extraordinary number of names he's known by. I mean, by the time he gets to Oregon, I think it's Bro Malley, a.k.a. J.K. Malley, a.k.a. Bishop James Malley of New Haven, Connecticut and New York, Reverend James Malley of New Haven, James Malley of New York, James K. Malley. I mean, it goes on, and James Malley, the Wild Irishman. I mean,
Wild Irishman,
he
indeed.
really kept going and going and going. And obviously it was catching up with him occasionally, but he was also getting away with it. So he now is starting to use, though, this king moniker by this stage in Oregon. How does he finally get to Australia? Because, of course, this is why he's relevant to us here in Australia today in 2024.
Absolutely. Yep. So he left 2nd of July, 1888 from San Francisco. I think the big attraction then was the Melbourne exhibition of 1888. And some people might recall that Melbourne at that time was one of the wealthiest cities in the world because of the gold rushes, etc. So it would have been an attractive proposition for a person looking for the main chance and possibly escaping some notoriety or infamy that may have been following him from state to state. He was already selling insurance in San Francisco with a colleague called Dunphy, who has a part to play. But yes, he leaves on the Mariposa and sails across, eventually arriving in Sydney at the end of July 1888. Now, just as a little byplay there, during the sailing across the Pacific, he was known as King at one point, but then when he arrived in the newspaper reports from New Zealand to Brisbane, he kind of disappears off, and another character appears called D.C. Kennedy. Now, D.C. Kennedy was a work colleague of his in San Francisco, and in other words, he had used his name for whatever reason, I'm not sure, from the New Zealand to the Brisbane leg of the journey. He borrows somebody else's identity, a person who used to work for him. He appears on the ship manifest all of a sudden, and O'Malley disappears. So he's still kind of ducking and weaving even at that stage. But then he arrives in Sydney as King O'Malley.
Do we know why he was doing that? I mean, I know there was another potential murder he was involved in of a young woman, Annie Davis, and there was some issues around his insurance fraud kind of catching up with him a bit. Was it fear of being discovered?
Yes, I have to say, well, I'm kind of inside his mind, having spent 4 years of researching it, but I don't know why at that point, because certainly prior to that, there are other newspaper reports, because the 4th of July occurred as they were sailing, and he's mentioned there that he was the orator for the day on the ship as part of their celebrations. So he was certainly happy enough to be portrayed as King O'Malley at that point, but then, as I say, one leg, he suddenly borrows his ex-workmate's name and he shows up on the manifest, or at least on the newspaper reports. So then he arrived in July 1888.
And this is for the Melbourne exhibition, and there were lots of US merchants who were showcasing their wares at the Melbourne exhibition. It was quite a massive event in 1888. There were lots of them, weren't there, around the world, and of course in Melbourne you have those beautiful Royal Exhibition buildings that were built to house this exhibition. So is he trying to showcase his insurance wares at the Melbourne exhibition? What's he got for sale?
Well, actually, he first appears in Melbourne promoting a fire protection, I use the word protection advisedly, a fire protection service where people would pay building owners, storekeepers, and they would pay money and they would ensure that the buildings, if they caught fire, that they would report very quickly to the local fire brigade, etc. And that kind of disappears without trace. Now, there's a little parentheses attached to that, because back in New Haven, where he was from, his uncle had several fires in his own department store. So there was a bit of a template there as well. Anyway, so O'Malley appears in Melbourne selling fire protection. That kind of disappears very quickly. Then he's in amongst all the journalists and telling great stories about the Wild West and stumping for politicians and this kind of thing. So he gets a reputation. At one point, he's chaired off somewhere by all the other journalists because of his fabulous storytelling. So he starts to get a reputation amongst the local journalists, that he says that he used to have a newspaper back in Kansas called escapes me anyway.
Well, it doesn't matter because we know it wasn't true anyway.
Probably not. That's right. Yeah, it's just made up.
So there's a story that when O'Malley comes to Australia, he decides that he'll one day be Prime Minister of Australia. So he continues to have a huge set of expectations for himself. The grandiosity continues across international
wherever
borders.
he goes.
How does he even get it into his head that he's going to be Australian Prime Minister? I mean, obviously there's no Commonwealth of Australia quite yet. That doesn't happen until 1901. But he's been interested in politics in the United States, been speaking on behalf of candidates. He's involved in the prohibition movement. Whether he believed these things or not, let's, query that. But he at least has this interest in politics, and now he's flirting with journalists. But to have that ambition of coming to a country and then saying, I'm going to be Prime Minister of it.
Yeah, that's right. Some of those statements were made probably a little bit later. He stood a couple of times in Wangaratta and in Tasmania. He tried a couple of times. It wasn't until the 1896 election that he was finally elected. And then he stood in the 1901 election, the first federal election. He stood for the seat of Darwin, which is not actually Darwin, but the seat of Darwin was on the west coast of Tasmania, as it turns out. So it was that very, very remote west coast miners and that kind of people who were voting, essentially. So he would stump for them. In terms of his ambitions, there was certainly one, I think I've quoted, it was around 1910, where he was quite convinced that in the next few years he was going to be the Prime Minister of Australia, because along with his made-up backstory that he was born in Canada, because that's when this kind of started, because as an American he couldn't stand, but if he'd been born in Canada as a Commonwealth citizen, he was eligible to stand. So he basically invented a story that his father was away on the Oregon Trail and his mother was heavily pregnant with him, and she had a sister across the border who had knocked her husband. So very late in the pregnancy, she goes across the border and delivers him in Canada. And that he says he was robbed of the opportunity to be the President of the United States. So he had to cut. Second best, he might as well come to Australia and be the PM here.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously he was cognizant of the Section 44 difficulty that he might otherwise have come up against. And, of course, many Australian politicians in 2018 would come up against that over 100 years later. This story that he's born in Canada and therefore a Commonwealth citizen and therefore eligible to stand for the Australian Parliament. Do people just accept that? They perhaps don't realise that he has this incredible history of con artistry and scamming. They didn't. They certainly didn't. I mean, I guess I'm the person who's put all that stuff together. But back at that point in 1896, because one of his platforms was to remove barmaids from pubs, and the Licensed Victuallers Association of the South Australian colony were very, very hot on his heels about the whole thing. So they tracked down a guy called Dunphy, who I alluded to a little while ago at the outset. So they wrote to this colleague of O'Malley's and said, can you tell us about him? So Mr. Dunphy dutifully writes back saying, yes, I've known him for ages. He's an upstanding citizen. He was a great worker. He was born in Canada, blah, blah, blah. So that was then kind of not quite put to rest, but it was certainly sufficient at that point in time to kind of hose down the immediate fire that was blazing around him. Well, I guess...
But it never went away, though.
Yes. I mean, in the 19th century, early 20th century, that was probably all you could do to verify people's stories if you weren't going to go and find birth certificates yourselves in various states of other countries that would require enormous amounts of resources, no doubt.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, but as I said, Dunphy was an ex-work colleague of his from way back, right from the very beginning when he was still James Malley, as it turns out, in 1883.
And perhaps was a beneficiary of some nice little contributions to his bank balance.
Possibly. I wouldn't be surprised.
We can speculate, Brian. What do you think it says about Australia at that time that someone like King O'Malley was able to enter the Parliament, and presumably sounding very American in his accent, and obviously his background's very unknown. He's running for a seat in a remote part of Tasmania, so perhaps it was easier to be elected where there weren't sort of huge population centres and people kind of talking to each other and interacting and muttering to each other about concerns they might have about a candidate. He could charm the crowds as he interacted with them with his oratory and his charisma, but he was able to get away with it. And what do you think it says about Australia at that time that he was?
Yes, that's an interesting question because, well, I've described him as a comet sweeping across the sleepy skies, colonial skies. And I think there was that back in those days, theatrical persona that he put forward was kind of entertaining as much as anything, entertainment and flamboyance. And in fact, was quoted often, he had a lavender-coloured coat that he used to wear, lavender. And he wore that around with a big kind of Stetson hat. So it was about attracting attention. And then he would tell stories to people and he would just wander up and down the city street and then people would talk about him. And it goes back to this whole thing of, in fact, a lesson he learned probably from his father and his uncle about advertising, that they were big advertisers back in Connecticut. So it was all about self-promotion, self-advertising, creating a scene around yourself. And I guess it probably did reflect Australia's, well, should I use the word backwater back in those days, that they weren't used to this kind of political theatre. Maybe there were other theatrical too, but certainly that persona went with him wherever he went for the next 20 years when he was in politics. People just couldn't help talking about him. The number of newspaper reports is just endless. In fact, the National Library of Australia that I utilised a lot has 11,000 items in it that he left behind in his archive, a number of which are newspaper clippings that he's collected along the way. So certainly he was always a person that was well talked about.
Well, and a Stetson and a lavender jacket,
coat.
Can well imagine he would have been noticed. And, of course, an American accent at a time when there wouldn't have been many American accents in Australia too. So he gets into Parliament and I mean, how are we not surprised? He does very well, doesn't he?
Yes, yeah, indeed. So he was elected in the 1901 Parliament and then until 1917. So his political career was basically 1896 to 1917. And through whatever machinations, eventually ends up being the Home Affairs Minister, with his eye on the main prize, of course, of Prime Minister.
Yes.
Still.
So he's Home Affairs Minister in the government of Andrew Fisher, Labor government. So he's a member of the Labor Party at this stage. He's got a passion for Canberra, despite being a member from Tasmania, but obviously the ambition is that the federal parliament will one day meet in Canberra. At that time, of course, it was meeting in Melbourne. But he really was very keen that Canberra be established as the national capital. As you said, it really should have been known as Myola or Shakespeare as very much a second choice. But he's often remarked upon as one of the fathers of Canberra. Do you think he deserves that title? I mean, what were his actual efforts to establish Canberra, not least trying to get it named after him by sort of some subversive way?
Yes, there was a party of senators and others who went around looking for the site. And one of the things that is remarkable in my own mind is one of the newspaper reports that says how all of the others on the entourage going around the country were all kind of burned out from the expedition, except for one person, and that was King O'Malley, because largely I suspect he enjoyed the kind of the adrenaline rush of travel and the newness and meeting new people. And he was described as basically the only one who was up to the job of going around assessing the different locations. He put forward of course, the Burley Griffin saga as well. That from what wasn't part of the research, but just in discussion that I had with some people, I think that the way he had designed the criteria for the architects for the design, that it eliminated a whole range of Anglo-British people and others, and it kind of pushed them towards an American as being the likely winner. I might stand corrected on that, but that's certainly what I understand, is that kind of he rigged the criteria so it would push people towards a particular. Anyway, the Burley Griffins ended up with the contract, and it's a city that I live in now, and it's a wonderful city, and that goes back to the original design. So certainly he had a big part to play in that, there's no doubt. The prohibition thing, I'm not sure when that finished. I have to say that most of my focus has been on the first 30 years and not the latter years, as it turns out. But certainly he has a suburb named after him, indeed, in Canberra. So I don't think that's overstated. I think clearly his influence extends to Canberra itself.
Yes, well, look,
in fact,
I think to have a pub named after you in Canberra really is all one needs. Yes. I mean, a suburb,
yes,
right.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it is kind of ironic. The irony, of course, is the whole thing.
Yeah, of course. The other thing he is known for is his contribution to the establishment of a national bank of Australia, the Commonwealth Bank, as it becomes.
Yes, yeah.
And it's interesting, actually, in the Menzies collection, there's actually a book by Leslie Jauncey that O'Malley sends to Menzies, we think in the early 1940s. And he's inscribed, it's called Australia's Government Bank, and the book is basically making the case for a National Bank of Australia. And while King O'Malley, of course, by this stage is well out of politics and Robert Menzies is well in politics, he says Brother Menzies, Great War Prime Minister, is in his inscription. So he's giving a sense that he's...
Brother Menzies.
Yes. Well, he's always trying to get that next chance, seeing if he can get some influence. But tell me about why he was so taken with this idea of a national bank for Australia and his relationship with Leslie Jauncey.
Yes. Jauncey, a significant amount of correspondence between the two of them, which I've quoted in the book about, many aspects, some including proofs of his links back to New Haven and the fact that he is James Malley. Jauncey, who he called Tovarish Jauncey, he was one of his acolytes, and he basically promulgated the booklet around many people. And I think it's, I suppose in 1917, from 1917 till his death in 1953, I guess there was a bit of deprivation that he wanted to be in the limelight still. So he pushed the book out to many people. I think his original idea for the bank was more of a kind of a reserve bank. Historians might correct me on this, I don't know, but the impression I had from reading the other biographies, of which there's 3 or 4, depending, one was a re-edition, he had an idea that I think the bank would be more a reserve bank stroke people's bank, but then the final model was more of just an established bank. I think he had in mind that it would have been a reserve bank dispensing currency, that kind of thing, because he had seen clearly from America, and he often quoted American figures about banks and this kind of thing and how banks can collapse and blah, blah, blah. So I think the model was not as radical in a sense. I mean, there's no doubt that he was a highly intelligent man and could see things, notwithstanding his kind of notoriety and some of the other moral questions about his behaviours. There's no doubt that he was highly intelligent. And I think that he had looked at banks in America and seen how they operated there, and that his idea of one bank for the people and also for currency creation as well was where he would have been aiming, and then he would have perceived that the final version was a bit of a watered-down measure. He also, as far as I recall, was very heavily involved in trying to establish an east-west railway line as well. So some of those things, I guess, in a way, are American ideas that he's digested and tried to establish. So certainly he had a part to play in the early years of the Federation, for sure.
Well, it's interesting to note on this, as we conclude this discussion, Brian, that with O'Malley's death in 1953, that was the passing of the last surviving member of the first federal parliament, elected in 1901. So he actually outlives Billy Hughes, and obviously only having himself 16 years in the parliament, and Billy Hughes had more than that. But at least he was sort of the kind of changing of the guard as he died for the next generation of political leaders like Robert Menzies. But it is an incredible story of its breathtaking audaciousness and his sense of grandiosity. And look, he got away with it till his dying days. So thank you so much for bringing this story to life and sharing it with me and our audience on Afternoon Light, Brian.
You're welcome, Georgina. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.